I hear it going door to door. I just talked to a man the other day. He said, yeah, I remember talking to you and your son about trucking regulations. This young man was trying to start a trucking company, and my son-in-law as well. The amount of money that you have to go through to pay, you have to get this inspected, and then you have to change this equipment, and then you have to get that inspected, and then if that doesn't work, you have to get something new. I mean, this is a huge problem for Kansas because we're the second most regulated state in the nation. It doesn't make any sense. So this is a huge help to give them at least some pause. So maybe we can do more to stop some of these massive regulations that are costing Kansas so much money, and they don't need to be spending that kind of money.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
All right, thanks for being with us for another episode of American Potential. Appreciate you being with us. So imagine with me that you own a business and you spend the majority of your day making sure that it's successful by getting up early and working while others are still sleeping, or staying up late at night because there's still something else that needs to get done. Your work weekends, almost every weekend, there just isn't enough time in the week, right? But it's all worth it because you're building something. Not only do you focus on running and growing your business, but you also have to make sure to follow federal and state laws, as well as keep up with rules and regulations that are put in place by different federal and state agencies. Now, it sounds like a lot to keep up with, but between a law, rule, or regulation, which do you think you would have a bigger say in? Well, rules, laws, and regulations don't have a lot of differences between them except which branch of government they come from. Laws are passed by a group of elected officials from the legislative branch. Rules and regulations are put in place by agencies from the executive branch, but they still have the same weight as a law. Sometimes a rule or regulation can have a cost associated with it and can directly impact a business or individuals. Now, the impact on a business can sometimes be so much that the owner has to make the decision to close because they just simply can't afford it. Now, one state recently decided to let businesses and individuals have more of a voice when it comes to certain new rules and regulations. I want to welcome Kansas State Representative Barb Wasinger and Randy Stookey, who is Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the Kansas Grain and Feed Association, on the show to talk about this new bill. Thanks for being with us, Barb and Randy.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, Barb, first I have to ask, this is quite an accomplishment. It says here, Monica put this in my notes, that you are the first woman in 100 years to hold a county commission seat in Ellis County. Is that right?
That's the truth.
Wow. That's
we're the
incredible.
First married couple to have served separately, but my husband was a county commissioner years before I was.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. That's good. Well,
So
that's
a lot
congratulations.
Of
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So, Randy, let me ask you first, talk about the Kansas Grain and Feed Association. Let us know what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for inviting us on today. So we actually work for two separate agribusiness organizations in Kansas. And so that's the Kansas Grain and Feed Association, representing the grain elevators in the great state of Kansas, and then also the Kansas Agribusiness Retailers Association. And just like it sounds, representing those businesses that sell all kinds of inputs to Kansas farmers. And so we're kind of on both sides of the ag production industry, the farming industry. So the inputs, it's a highly regulated industry on the front end, on both at the state and federal level by various agencies. And then on the back end with the grain elevators, again, a very highly regulated industry. So we Since 1896, the grain and feed industry, KGFA, in Kansas has represented the interests of the grain and feed industry in the state. We work to speak on behalf of the industry and represent the interests of the both the agribusiness, grain and feed, and ag retail before the state legislature, our congressional delegation, and as you've started this morning, the point of this podcast is before the regulatory agencies, both state and federal.
So let me have you. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay, so Randy, if you can explain, let's talk about the regulations. You said it's a highly regulated industry. Talk about some of the regulations and how those work for your industry.
So, for the grain side, I would say that both the storage of grain, it can be due to dust hazards it can be an unsafe environment for dust explosions. Historically, that's been an issue. So for federally, it's the principal regulator is OSHA, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. For the transport then of grain, as you move the grain to domestic or export purposes, the USDOT and the state regulators for the transportation industry highly regulate that industry as well. We're talking about trucking at this point and on the rail. For CARA, for the ag retailers, storage and handling and transportation of seed and fertilizer and ag chemical pesticides, that is a very highly regulated industry, both through principally the federal FIFRA Act, and then as delegated to the state by the State Department of Agriculture, and then directly, and then secondarily by both the EPA and Kansas Department of Health and Environment for the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act regulations, and then again USDOT and Kansas Corporation Commission transportation. So across the board, daily, we could have our members could have multiple state and federal agencies at their door, looking over their shoulder, regulating, which is many times necessary regulations. Let's be clear, but it's the implementation of those regulations and the extent of the regulations that we principally are concerned with, and that we believe the bill that we're going to talk about today really addresses. So
yeah. So as you explained that, I mean, I'm sure many times you saw where regulators came in and made a rule which maybe didn't make sense or was pretty onerous on the industry. And we'll get into this law a little bit, but that's really what this was an attempt to do, right? Is to stop these kind of onerous regulations that have severe impact on your industry, right?
Right. And at least, if not stop, then to give stakeholders, the regulated community and industry in the state, more of a voice before those that are answerable to elected or the voters. Currently, the way that they were before this bill was passed, at least in Kansas, the deck was really stacked against the regulated community. The legislature really had no true voice in stopping any proposed regulation of the executive agency or executive branch. That was merely a show hearing that was required by state law. But at the end of the day, the executive branch, regardless of who was the governor at the time, could propose and then adopt whatever regulation they deemed was appropriate.
Yeah. Barb, let me go to you. Can you share the story of how you saw regulations have a direct impact on a community?
When I got into the legislature 6 years ago, I was put on joint administrative rules and regs, and I was horrified. Former Representative Ron Highland was the chair. And I got up from the first meeting and I said, okay, I must be really slow, but okay, They just come to us and tell us what they want to do. And we can tell them we don't want them to, but they can just do it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, no, you understand this. And I said, that's wrong. Why do we even have this committee? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I have a couple of examples of recent things that have happened and come before our committee. Number one that didn't end up happening, but the Department of Agriculture, which is so fond of overregulating Randy's area, they decided that because of chronic wasting disease, they would cancel the fall hunting season in Kansas. Kansas is a big hunting state, huge. It's a huge economic driver. But they said there was zero economic impact to anyone. And it's almost out of this world. I said, are you not thinking, this is just unbelievable. First, you're not going to get the licensing for these hunters. Number two, we're not going to get anybody in from out of state that would bring in lots of dollars from all over the country, which we have now. What about the hunting lodges? They're not going to lose any money. What about the restaurants, the hotels, the gas stations, everywhere? And they said, well, we can't figure that out. And I said, well, the Department of Agriculture is literally in the same building as wildlife or tourism parks. So you could go to the Tourism Bureau and that's all they do is figure out how much money's brought into the state from different things that we do. They ended up not doing that. Another example is the Department of Labor changed workman's comp law by regulation. They brought in 8 different regulations, and I get a little apoplectic. They were basically legislating by regulation, and that's the key to this. These executive agencies have people in their little offices, or whether they're working remote, since our governor doesn't make anybody come in to a agency. They changed workman's comp law, and I said, this should not be here. This should be in judiciary for them to decide. I was able to stop 3 out of the 8. So 5 of the regulations passed through. I sent it back to the AG's office to look over them, and they still were able to change 5 of them. And I said, how many people, even attorneys, you're trying to look through the statute books to see if anything is covered under this. But you have to look through pages and pages of regulations to figure out where the other changes are. I mean, and then for other things, just as simple. The first year I was there, they decided that they had to, all salons had to have 2 sinks, a hair sink and a work sink. The next year I was driving back home and I went into town and I saw all these little home salons were closed. And I thought, it was because some of these older cosmetologists that were doing perms for their ladies and doing little jobs, they just had a little salon in the back of their houses. They just shut them down because they weren't going to pay to get new sinks. So everything has a result. Everything has a consequence. And what I see over and over again is that agencies just pass things by regulation. They don't come to the legislature, and we don't get any kind of voice in what's going on for the people in Kansas.
Yeah. And you talked about this, but it bears repeating, I think, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. This flies in the face of what our founders set up, right? Our founders wanted an accountable government. They wanted a government where if the citizens don't like a rule or law or something that they have to live under, they could go to their elected official who could actually make change on that. That is thrown out the window when you have regulatory agencies that really aren't accountable and can just go ahead and pass these rules. And we see that at the federal level, we see it at the state level, and even at the local level. Your thoughts on that, Barb?
Well, already the federal government passed their REINS Act trying to, pull these agencies in. And we tried to pass a constitutional amendment to allow us to send things back to the legislature, even without the restrictions of the REINS Act that we passed. When we saw egregious things, we could then take it to both houses in the building to decide whether it was egregious, that it should go to the legislature to do. And it's all just trying to give it back. Like I said, make legislators do legislation, agencies can do some regulations, but they have gone out of control. We're going to try to pass another constitutional amendment, but whether you have a Democrat in the governor's mansion or you have a Republican, you can't let them take over and do the legislation by regulation. It's just wrong.
Right.
We have our own jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And you are accountable to the voters, which of course these bureaucrats are not. Randy, let me ask you, talk about what it was like when there was a new rule or regulation that was being discussed before this bill was passed. What was it like?
So really, we're talking about the current process. And I mean, after July 1, the new process has begun. But before July 1, before this bill, that process really left the regulated community without sufficient recourse. And I would argue the legislature as well, to address concerns on any given proposed regulation. And those proposed regulations are put forward and published as proposed by unelected executive branch employees who are either appointed or hired by and answerable only to the governor, whomever the governor might be. Mm-hmm. That's why the change in this bill, House Bill 2648, is so important. And I will say that Kansas as a state, was an outlier. Most states have a process similar to what was allowed for now under House Bill 2648. So we were in a very untenable situation, us being either the regulated industry or the legislature. Because before the executive agency rather would put forward whatever they intended to do, and there really was no recourse by the legislature other than to pass a bill which the executive branch would override their proposed regulation. So this bill, once it went to the governor, was likely to be vetoed. And so now you're setting up a 2/3 majority threshold for a veto override in order to override any proposed executive agency regulation. That was the situation before. And so essentially it gave the executive branch agencies carte blanche authority to do as they deemed appropriate with no legislative oversight. And our argument the entire time then was that these state agencies themselves are creatures of statute. They don't exist in the state constitution. They were put into existence by state law, by the legislature, as was then every act that secretary or agency carries out, to include the promulgation of rules, regulations to carry out the act. And generally the language of the act is that broad. And so there, again, was really no stopgap for the executive branch agencies or secretaries at that point. There's nobody saying you've gone too far. Now, the state attorney general's office has that responsibility, but if the standard is to pass regulations to carry out the act, there really is no standard for the attorney general to weigh that against. Here now, under the new law, if it meets that $1 million over 5 years threshold, which we think is appropriate, at least to start out with and see how many regulations might fall inside that parameter. Now the executive branch agency must then go back to the legislature and essentially ask the legislature to affirm that the proposed regulation falls within the authority, that the constitutional authority to create law, essentially, that the legislature has delegated to the executive branch. So, Jeff, just as you set out in your opening, this is a constitutional issue, and one that we've argued for a long time was out of balance. It was out of balance, and we think has, under this bill, has achieved greater balance and will going forward.
Right. Barb, let's expand on that a little bit. I know Randy kind of explained a little bit about what the bill does, but any additional thoughts on how it rebalances the balance of power between the legislative and the executive branch?
It clearly has already started slowing some people down, and I probably shouldn't say this. Board of Cosmetology or Board of Pharmacy has, for the last 4 years, tried to pass some mileage and size of town rules for telepharmacies, and it's been blocked by various means. They just sent that in front of Joint Rules and Regs, and in the meeting, I said, this was denied by the legislature, and they took it out of legislation. Well, they've decided, after this has passed, that they would wait and go through the insurance committee so that they can make sure that it was okay with the legislature. It's giving some of these agencies some pause. Mm-hmm. I don't think we would have had the Department of Ag try to cancel a hunting season, so that they felt that it would work with the chronic wasting disease, which I'll admit I don't know very much about, but not even thinking about the impact on Kansans is frightening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the big brother coming and doing whatever they want to. And Randy sees it all the time. I'm sure he hears it from his members of his association. I hear it going door to door. I just talked to a man the other day. He said, yeah, I remember talking to you and your son about trucking regulations. This young man was trying to start a trucking company, and my son-in-law as well. The amount of money that you have to go through to pay, you have to get this inspected, and then you have to change this equipment, and then you have to get that inspected. And then if that doesn't work, you have to get something new. I mean, this is a huge problem for Kansas because we're the second most regulated state in the nation.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. So this is a huge help to give them at least some pause. So maybe we can do more to stop some of these massive regulations that are costing Kansas so much money, and they don't need to be spending that kind of money.
Right. Now, you talked about the different, Kansas being a state that's passed this law, and I want to talk about you ended up having to override the veto of the governor to do it. Have other states passed this? What can you tell us about maybe other states that are taking this same approach? Barb.
I do not know of other states that have done it. I know that the federal government passed the REINS Act. Right. I think we're all just trying to work together. Yeah. I apologize for the noon whistles and
that's okay.
The tornado sirens. That's the only thing I didn't plan for. But I know that we are all trying to wake people up and say, we understand regulations are needed. We understand that there are some things that we need to take care of and make sure that people are safe. But beyond that, I think people are awakening to the fact that we can't continue to do this. We're stifling business, and it kills people from even wanting to try to open a business because of the cost and the effort that you have to go through.
Well, so Barb, now this bill was vetoed by the governor. What was the reasoning for the governor doing that? And what did the legislature do about that?
It's always because there's a law that was there was a lawsuit, Stephan versus the Kansas House of Representatives, that stopped our ability to stop government agencies from doing these regulations beyond their frame of reference. And so that's why we need a constitutional amendment to change it completely, to be able to not stop all of these agencies. But the governors, all of the agencies are concerned with us taking too much power away from them. And they've obviously gotten a lot of power by not having to listen to anyone in the legislature or the organizations like Green and Feed Association saying this is hurting our members. This isn't a safety issue. This is just a pure regulation that is legislating what we do and is not correct. So I know that the executive branch feels like they have to protect their turf. We all feel like that. And when we're working, we need to protect the things that we're responsible for. And when I would talk to some of the Democrats about this, they said, well, you shouldn't be telling agencies what to do. And I said, well, bureaucrats shouldn't be passing laws by regulation.
Right.
And so that it's a mindset, along with a lot of other things, but they just are protecting their turf is my best answer for that.
Right. But ultimately the legislature had to override the veto of the governor, correct?
Yes. We had enough people that agreed with us and understood that this is a problem. And I gave the speaker a lot of examples from rules and regs. And we worked very hard, but we'd also worked hard the year before trying to get the other constitutional amendment passed and just barely lost that vote. So I think with our constant telling of our colleagues, we are supposed to pass the laws. The executive branch is not supposed to be doing it. And they are definitely legislating by regulation. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm glad that you did it. And frankly, legislatures need to do a better job of stepping up and sort of jealously guarding, their role in the process. It seems like, and I know at the federal level, we see it all the time. Congress sometimes sits back and allows either the executive or the judicial branch to grab more power, and legislators seem to somehow think that's okay. And sometimes they even give them more power, just like willingly hand over legislative power and authority. And they shouldn't do that. I mean, that's the way our system was built, is for each of those different branches to be able to have that friction and to have that tug against one another. And it seems like unless we have a legislature that is pushing back and trying to grab and jealously guard their authority, you have executive agencies that just run amok. I mean, do you see it that way, Barb?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I can bring up and get off the topic, which I won't do, where the judicial branch has gone out of their way to make decisions that are not deciding what the Constitution actually says. I mean, this is not in a vacuum. There are so many instances of agencies and departments and divisions that are trying to circumvent the legislature. And I just keep working on it. I had someone come up to me in the Capitol and said, "Oh, aren't you the one that's all big on rules and regs?" And I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I don't want any of them." I think we really, one thing that we did do or were able to do was tell them that every 5 years there's a rotation of agencies that have to go through and get rid of the regulations that they know are not correct. They know are they're not using and conflict with go in conflict with other regulations. And so we are getting some movement of pulling back some of the regulations that have been on forever, that like you can't wear brown shoes on Sundays. I mean, that's not one, but those are some of these regulations are in direct conflict with the rest of their regulations. So we're working on it, and I'm kind of annoying, a little bit of a pest. I try every time someone brings a bill in, I go up to the well and say, you cannot just say you shall develop rules and regulations. We've got to be on top of these things and stop them before they start. We have to give them a framework of where they should be doing their regulations so that we can make sure it is with legislative intent of what they're doing as opposed to not.
Right. Randy, talk about what it's going to be like now with this bill now passed and law, what it's going to be like for your industry versus the way that it was before.
Yeah, so very simply, the bill is going to provide the regulated community, such as my industry, with greater legislative oversight of the executive agency rulemaking process. That's a very broad way of saying that the agencies should have a limited rulemaking authority that's delegated specifically by the legislature. And we're going to make sure through this bill and the amended process that any new regulations or amended regulations that are proposed by the agency fall within that delegated authority. And this is really it's not a small issue. It's not just the one individual regulation that we're talking about. It's the whole process. It's I think that you alluded to early on is that under our system of government, the executive branch of government has no inherent power to create law. That's given to the legislature to do. And make no mistake, these rules and regulations have the force and effect of law, not just for safety and health. We're talking about licensing, the ability to suspend or revoke a license, which means the ability to do business in the state of Kansas. The assessment of very high civil penalties and fees at times. That's what we're really talking about when we talk about rules, regulations, and the scope of those regulations. And so two things really. Does the proposed regulation or amended regulation fall within the authority that's been delegated to the agency by the legislature? And then does the legislature now, is it their intent that the scope of what's being asked by or proposed by the regulation fall within the legislative intent, i.e. the size of a penalty or the increase in amount of fees? Some of these fees are very expensive. And then just the regulatory framework itself, what is being regulated? Does that what's being proposed in the regulation fall within the intent of the legislature? And that's where it should reside. And here, we're talking about specifically those regulations that have a cost or an economic impact on the regulated community of $1 million or more over a 5-year period. If it reaches that threshold, then we're going to have the legislature take a look at it and say, yes, we're going to affirm, the legislature will affirm that the proposed regulation does fall or does not fall within the delegated authority. And if not, then, I guess either the governor or some other stakeholder could come in and convince the legislature to broaden that authority that's been delegated to the executive branch. But again, the executive branch has no authority on its own to create law. That authority has to be delegated by the legislative branch.
Right. Last question, I guess, Barb. A lot of people will talk about how this would have an impact on businesses in Kansas, but it also has a positive effect, I think, on consumers as well. Talk about that. How does it help consumers?
It's going to have a huge effect on consumers, because that 1 million in 5 years, all of that gets passed to all of us as consumers. you cannot do a business. You cannot have a business, an agribusiness or anything, if you're being regulated and licensed more and more and more and more money going into what you have to do. You have to pass that along to your customers. So it will do nothing. If anything, it will help keep some of the costs down for for Kansans, because they're already spending a lot of money on regulations, and they don't even realize how much of what they buy and pay for that is due to the fact that regulations have passed that cost the person more to get that at the store or to your table.
Right. Well, Barb, thank you. And Randy, thank you. I appreciate both of you joining us, talking about this great step that the state of Kansas has taken. So thank you, Randy. Thank you, Barb, for being with us.
Yes. Stay tuned. We're going to try to do more.
Sounds great.
And we'll get help. I'll get help from Randy.
Thanks, Barb.
All right. Well, listen, this is one of the great examples of, legislators and folks in the community working together to make sure that it's done right. We don't want runaway rogue agencies that are out regulating without the consent of the governed. That's what our founders envisioned at the national level and in our states. Our drafters, our framers of our Constitution and state constitutions as well envisioned people who are accountable, legislators accountable to citizens. And so this is a way to help restore that by passing a REINS Act. And I hope other states will follow Kansas's lead here and pass a REINS Act as well. So listen, thanks for joining us. If you'd like to get connected with an Americans for Prosperity state chapter, be sure to email me at jeff@americanpotential.com. And we're always looking for stories to help keep you inspired and informed. And the best way to stay connected is by liking and subscribing to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And finally, if you know of a great story of someone that's working to expand freedom and opportunity that we should share, be sure to go to our website, americanpotential.com, and fill out our Share Your Story section. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate you joining us on American Potential.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.